Hi everyone, my name's Declan McGlynn. Welcome to Friday Forum Live, Point Blank's weekly broadcast bringing you exclusive tutorials, artist interviews and industry insight every Friday, live from East London. And as the hardware revival continues, we are joined by Point Blank instructor Anthony Chapman to take a look at syncing and triggering external synths from Ableton Live. So today is all about external synths and Ableton Live. And if you want to learn more about Ableton, mixing and all that good stuff, make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. And if you don't want to miss another tutorial, make sure you click subscribe below this video. And we are live, so get your questions in for Anthony and we'll get to them throughout the broadcast. Anthony, welcome back.
It's a pleasure to be back.
Oh man, how are you?
Yeah, I'm good. I enjoyed getting all this set up.
Yeah.
It's good fun.
Getting a bit hands-on with stuff again.
Exactly. And as you say, there's a bit of a revival for all this stuff now as well. So
plus, it's really affordable.
Absolutely. So shall I dive in? Yeah. So what I want to look at today is basically just covering a few things to do with getting an external instrument like the one I've got here. So I've got the Arturia Micro Brute. This is mine. I brought this with me. I love this keyboard. I noticed I've left a bit of blue tack on there. I'll take that off. That's how I attach my patch cables when I'm transporting it. And I really love this synth. It's a bit crazy. It doesn't really sound like anything else. It's very simple. It's quite cheap. No, I'm not going to say cheap. Affordable. This is really affordable. Yeah. And I do know a lot of people who have dived in to getting one of these because it's quite a good entry point to getting into synthesis. I mean, I've got friends with gigantic modular synths and that's all very sexy. But for me personally, this is more what I need because I just need something really quick and easy to use to get some good sounds which I can then use alongside other stuff. So what I wanted to look at is basically the kind of setup that I use to get this going in my sessions in Ableton, because to be honest, in a way, it's almost like a kind of a lost art, really. Because when I started out, this is half of what we had to do. Was half of the session would be getting stuff plugged in, getting stuff synced up, making sure MIDI's working. I can remember doing sessions with 3 Akai samplers and God knows how many keyboards and cables all over the place. And obviously, everything's got a lot simpler. And for many years, we all kind of moved away from hardware. But I think people are enjoying returning to it, partly for the sound of it, but I think also there's something really enriching and enjoyable about getting your hands on with something and really creating something outside of the DAW environment. So obviously, MIDI is really important, but generally speaking nowadays, it's quite rare that I would use a MIDI cable, and I suspect maybe some of the people watching the broadcast may not have even used the MIDI cable. MIDI cable is the standard that they used for MIDI for many years. It's kind of like a round DIN connector with 5 pins in it. But nowadays, USB tends to carry MIDI, and the Micro Brute's no exception. We've got a MIDI port, USB port on the back. This only carries MIDI. It doesn't carry audio, okay? There are some, I was saying to Declan before, there are some restrictions with the Micro Brute. If you're thinking about getting one, make sure you go to Arturia's website and just be sure you know what you're getting, because I know some people expect to get this and use the controls on the front as a control surface and stuff like that, and you can't do that with this. This is a very, very analog focused machine.
So you can't automate any of that from
not like from the DAW, but obviously we can record stuff in, which is what I really like. So I'm using my USB connection here to do the MIDI in and out. So basically, I can use the keyboard to send stuff to Ableton. Interestingly, the keyboard sends velocities, but it doesn't use velocities within the synth. So you can actually use it as a little controller. So this is doing all of my MIDI, and then I've got the audio out here, which I'm putting into this interface here. Okay, now if we go over to live, let's just look and see how we've got this set up, because this is, even me as an old bugger, I had to stop and think when I started using external stuff with Ableton Live. I had to kind of get up to speed with doing this stuff because it's a little bit different from some others. So if we go to the MIDI sync tab, okay, and we've got this array of ports here. Some of this is stuff that's actually connected. Some of these weird IAC things are actually nothing to do with Ableton Live. They're things that I use for Pro Tools. But we've got, you can see here, we've got 2 sets of ins and outs for the Micro Brute. Now this is something when I first got it that I kind of scratched my head about. But what it is that there's actually a MIDI port on the back, a MIDI, if I can remember, MIDI in. Yeah, there's a MIDI in on the back. And so these things that say MIDI interface, this is dealing with actual MIDI. So you can actually use this to bring MIDI in from other devices. The ones that say unknown MIDI device, this is the USB connection. Okay. Really helpful.
Not confusing at all.
Yeah, not confusing at all.
Unknown MIDI.
So you'll notice here that I've got various things switched on. Some of the really important ones are obviously track, which means that it's going to take note data from those sources, but also the sync button as well. And I'm going to demonstrate in a minute what we're using that for. We're actually using that to sync the clock of the Micro Brute to Ableton Live, so it will follow the tempo. And I know, and we did have a question about that as well, didn't we?
We've had questions already, so yeah.
Yeah, we had a question about the microcorg and the clock. And
yes.
I've been doing I did a quick little bit of Googling around, and it looks like it depends which. Somebody asked.
Michael Beckstead, he said, please touch on MIDI tempo slaving. So yeah, he says microcorg, for example, doesn't have a tempo readout, so syncing to Ableton is a pain in the ass.
Yeah, it's. I guess what you need to find out is if that microcorg. I mean, he said microcorg, so let's assume it's the standard original microcorg.
The original, the classic.
What you need to find out with that is, can it take MIDI clock on the MIDI input? Because we can tell Ableton to send the clock. We can use the sync tab there, but we need to know if the microcorg can receive it. You might have to go in and change a setting on it somehow. I know that I've found some stuff on the Ableton website where people were talking about, and we think it was possibly the microcorg XL, which had USB, and you could set that to receive clock over USB. But I would say that's the area you want to be looking in. I'm not experienced with that stuff on the microcorg specifically, but that's the area you want to look at. Now, so I've got my stuff activated here. So you can see I've got audio coming in on this track. Now, if we look as well here, you can see that I've got MIDI coming in. So all of these MIDI channels are set to all channels for the inputs. So you can see we're getting MIDI data coming in. But where things start to get a little bit different in Ableton Live is with this device, the external instrument. Okay, and we find that under the Instruments tab. So you see we've got this here, external instrument. Now this is really useful. Basically what this does is we put this in the signal path here, and we can set it to, it will basically dictate where the MIDI's going and where it's bringing the audio back from. Now, the advantage of that is it means that the audio from the synth actually turns up here in the chain, in the signal chain on this channel, which means that we can add effects to it afterwards. And we can basically, if you want, you can just run it live in your session. So if I just run, I've got just some little, this is nothing flash. And it's totally dry at the moment. So I'm just tweaking the cutoff there. Yeah, I do, honestly, the Micro Brute, this is really dry at the moment, but something I really like about it is it doesn't really sound like anything else. It's got a funny little sound of its own. I do really, really like it, but it is totally dry. So now that we've got it coming in here in our channel, what we can do is then place effect after, because I'm actually monitoring the Micro Brute through Ableton Live. We're not listening to it on a direct monitor with the interface. We're actually listening to it through Ableton Live. So I can go in and let's say, go pop a chorus on it. So we can start playing with it like that. We can also, because it's coming straight up on the channel here, we can start using the sends on it as well. So I can send it to a reverb and a delay. So this is all, everything is running. It's almost like an insert. It's like a software insert. It's basically bringing it into the signal chain, and then we can process it any way that we want. Now, So that's just using it to do a really simple, just sending it a few notes, working with some effects after it, working with some sends and returns. That's all well and good. But a lot of modern, I guess, what would I call them, like future retro kind of synths that we have now, you know, obviously Novation and lots of other people have got stuff like this.
Mini synths, yeah.
Yeah, little mini synths. They've got, a lot of time they've got sequencers on board, and that can really introduce some interesting stuff as well. So the microboot's no exception. So we've got this on the down in the corner here, we've got the sequencer, and you can basically have 8 patterns within it. So if I switch that to play, when I hit a key, so it's playing a bunch of notes there. Okay, but it's playing it really slow because I've got the rate down low. If I turn it up, so you see, it's like, it's all controlled by that as well. We can tap the tempo there. We can also record our own sequences. If we put it into record, it's literally just press a note and it will go to the next step in the sequence. You hit the button here to put a rest in. That might sound, to those of you used to writing with, you know, the grid and stuff like that, you might think that seems really limiting, but it's cool because it makes you do stuff that you wouldn't do. Doing it that way, it's really nice. If you think about the sound of classic electro and early house and techno, you know, most of the sequences in that would have been done in this way, step time, and that's kind of why you get that. 303 is the classic example of that. The entire sound of the 303 and the feeling of it is entirely based on that step time sequencing. So because in the settings, in the MIDI window of the preferences, I turned on that sync there for the output to the microboot unknown interface. I kind of wish I could rename that. That would be really nice. That means that when I play, this should sync the internal clock to Ableton Live. Okay, so if I so that's great. That's just playing its, you know, playing its sequence. So all I'm sending this is one note.
Right, and that's the root note of the sequence?
Yep.
Okay.
And if I wanted, I could change that to a different note. And also, you know, with the nice little quick modifications we can make in Ableton Live, I take it down an octave.
Slightly behind, isn't
it does sound slightly behind. I must say, I wasn't using this interface when I set this up. So let's take a look, because there's stuff we can do to try and compensate for that.
I know, and I mean, I've got JX3P, Juno 106, DX7, and CS10.
Yeah.
All MIDI sequenced in my studio, and they're all just like randomly out.
Yeah,
so.
it's tough sometimes. Now, in the external instrument device, well, actually, first thing we should check is, if we go into our preferences, into the audio, at the moment, I've got the buffer set to 64 samples, so that's pretty, you know, that's pretty much, you should be able to do everything playing live at 64 samples. You should be all right. 32, if you can do it, is great, but 64 should be totally fine. But what we can do here is we can turn up this control here for the hardware latency.
That's better, yeah.
So basically, as I turn up that latency, it kind of like pulls everything else back.
Okay.
And then, so obviously it can't like take your synth and make it happen earlier in time. If Ableton could do that, they would be onto something. You know? But as we turn that up, it just basically shifts everything else back.
Right.
And so that, yeah, it's fun. I mean, you know, it's something that I would like sort of tweak and just try and make sure that I've got exactly right.
So I guess, is it interface dependent and buffer size dependent?
I find, yes,
Okay.
it is. The very old, slightly decrepit interface that I was using last night, what in its favour, it seemed to be rock solid.
Okay.
You know, these interfaces are great. I think it's just something that you would have to kind of get right and get set up. One thing, obviously, is in the preferences, we do have the setting there for driver error compensation. There's instructions on the Ableton site to kind of go through the process of trying to figure out what latency the the interface is introducing. And if you go through this process, you can actually, it will give you a figure which you can put in there, and that should line everything up. But I mean, just quickly using that hardware latency thing in the external instrument, that's really helping.
And you just do it by ear?
I tend to, yeah. But then again, it is possible that you could, if you're doing something quite rhythmic, you could record it and have a look at where it is on the timeline. So if you just recorded a clip down. So I mean, I can just show you that quickly now, because that's the other thing that I really wanted to look at, is thinking about the signal flow. Because it's slightly complicated, because we're using an external device which is coming in on the analog input, but we're also using effects internally, okay? So if I've got like an audio track here, okay? And I've got my input here to set to external input 1. If I put that into record, my monitor's off, because I don't want to actually monitor this as I'm recording it. If I just... So I recorded that, and then I just hit play on the clip straight away. So I can now stop this one. Pretty much there. It's better than it was. Again, if I was doing this for real, I would probably sit down with it for a bit and try to like take a look at where it is on the grid. But the one thing I want you to notice is listen to the original sequence. And then if we listen to the one I recorded, this one's totally dry.
Yeah.
So what we have to remind ourselves of is, why do they sound so different? Because obviously this had this chorus effect on it, and it had reverb and delay. But we're taking the input of the synth here directly from that analog input 1. So all we're recording is this. We're just recording the sound of the synth. So therefore, unless we move that effect over to that channel as well, and unless we set our sends up the same, we're going to get that dry signal. If we wanted to, we could tweak this slightly, and we could say audio from, let's see, brute. So if we set this to audio from brute, what we're going to get is what's happening on this channel, including anything that's in the signal path.
Okay.
Okay. So if I hit record there, should have set that to less of a counting. Hang on, we're not actually recording there.
They're in the monitoring.
Yeah. Is that it? Or I think it might actually... Yeah, it's not actually coming through. That's embarrassing. I don't know if you've got any questions there, and I'll try and
yeah,
diagnose.
there's questions coming in, yeah. I think the
what...
sequence just needs to be playing.
Oh, of course it does.
Yeah.
That would help. Yeah. Here we go. Yeah, here we go. And then we can see here, you can see the latency there, okay? So you can see how much that is off the grid there. That is what we're looking at, okay? So it's quite a lot, but what we would do, remember, what I recorded the first time was direct from this, so there's no latency from within Ableton. This was recorded through all the effects, so that's going to introduce even more latency. Okay. Ableton, unfortunately, has never been the best for correcting plug-in delay compensation. It is better since 9.2. It's a lot better, but for stuff like this, you would just have to do a little bit of work to set yourself up so that this is back on the grid. For me personally, when I'm working on something and I'm putting a bit of live stuff in from this, a lot of the time, if I'm working with somebody else and they don't really want to sit there while I figure out what the latency is, I'll just record it and move it. I'll just, I'll look at that and go, well, I just need to move that back, and then I'll just trim it and render it, and then I know I've got it in time. So it's, so really it's a kind of a balancing act. You kind of need to work out what it is you want to do. If you've got the luxury of being able to leave it running live for as long as possible, then just leave it there. Just work with it live, and then when you want to, when you want to finish and you want to put it down as audio, then put it in and figure out the latency that way. So I think that's fine. So, yeah.
Cool. So if you set it up and everything was running live in MIDI, and then you changed the buffer size because you wanted to introduce more mixing plugins, would you have to revisit the latency settings?
That's a good question. Yeah, that's something with Ableton Live I would just have to test specifically. I mean, you shouldn't notice a difference when it's playing. I guess really it depends how you're monitoring it. If you're bringing it in through the external instrument device, that's going to introduce some latency. But the thing obviously with an interface like this, we do have the direct monitor. So you could just while you're writing, you could just run it on direct monitor. So we're hearing the direct output of this coming to the monitors. Then when you decide, okay, I want to commit something to audio, then you could okay, how am I going to do this? Do it with the external instrument, figure out the latency.
We were talking about this already. That's the thing about all this new kit that's coming out, because some of it has USB sound, and it introduces another issue because it's converting it inside the machine.
Exactly. If this was carrying audio over USB, the latency would be a much, much bigger problem than it is, But it's, again, like I said, that's why I like this. It's simple. I'm old. This is simple.
So if you what would you recommend if you had a sound card that you trusted and used a lot, and then you got a bit of kit that had USB audio, you are tempted to use the USB because it's going to have better quality. There's going to be less noise introduced with analog cables.
Well, we did have that question, didn't we, about the TR8?
Exactly.
And so we had a question coming in about the TR8 and trying to get that to sort of sync up with the DAW. And I've not used the TR8 personally, but I know lots of people who do. Obviously, in Point Blank, lots of people do, because we've got lots and lots of them.
Yes, we do.
And it's a great machine, but I've heard a lot of people have had problems with when they're using it because it's got a USB interface in it, hasn't it? So, and I believe it runs at quite a high sample rate as well, which theoretically could exacerbate the latency problems even more. Maybe this is just me being a bit old school, but I would be tempted to just go analog. I would be tempted to just use the analog output. If you use balanced cables, if you've got an interface that isn't from the 1990s, and it's got balanced inputs, it should be fine. It should sound good. And to be honest, I would say, you were saying obviously a lot of the time we think, it's probably going to have better quality, but 808s and 909s didn't have digital audio out, and they sounded pretty good.
They did.
So,
that's a good point.
Yeah, I think
it was actually, just to give the guy a shout out, it was Morgan Huggins who asked us that, and he's actually elaborated by saying, with the TR8 you can set it up so that it's your sound card, which is great.
Yeah.
So you can actually use it to power your speakers as well.
Yeah.
Because you can have separate audio track for each instrument, but the latency is unreal, and it's not set up as an external instrument. So what should I do? I would say don't use it as your sound card. You can, but I think that's more for using it live.
I think you need to.
Once you're in the studio,
I think you really need to make it. You need to simplify it. You need to simplify the setup. I would advise. Like I said, I'm kind of throwing stuff out there. I'm not a user of it, but from my experience with other stuff, it tends to be you need to kind of make it a little bit more straightforward. And honestly, I think every analog audio input is going to introduce a degree of harmonic distortion.
That's no bad thing.
I think it's a good thing.
Yeah.
I think it's good. Crank it a little bit. Don't clip it in the DAW, but clipping, or driving the input a little bit hard. There's nothing wrong with that. I guarantee you, there's endless huge records of the kind of 90s and early 2000s where loads of the kind of aggressive sounds were basically the line input on a Mackie desk being driven into the red. So, but I mean, that's not even what we're talking about here. We're just talking about using the analog. I would just say try and simplify it.
Keep it simple,
yeah. I think using it as a sound card, it combined with that really high sample rate, is possibly, it sounds to me anyway, like it's introducing some trouble. Honestly, I've heard it from so many people as well. So I think this is definitely an area that Roland maybe need to tweak it a little bit,
Yeah. Cool. So Marco Lombardi's asking, he says, you're amazing. Well
That's not a question.
How are you amazing? Can you please explain how to prevent MIDI feedback loops? I have 3 synths, a MIDI interface, and 2 control surfaces for Ableton Live.
Right. Okay. So
right, Marco.
I can, or at least I can put you on the right track. Okay. I thought it was something I was going to need to have to sort out with this, but in fact, it's not been a problem. There's a command. There's a parameter on lots of hardware synths called, well, usually, I'm pretty sure in Roland it was called, and Korg, it's called local. Okay, and basically, usually buried somewhere in the options of these devices is this option to turn local on or off. And all local means is when you hit a key, it plays a sound. Okay, and
it doesn't send MIDI.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
So if you hit a key, it will play a sound from the device. If you turn local off, hitting the key will not automatically trigger the device. It will send MIDI, but the MIDI will need to come back and tell the device to play. So local is something that I often had to wrestle with if you were in a situation where somebody had, a keyboard workstation that they also used as their master keyboard, and they had a load of other gear as well. So you would turn local off so that they could go, oh, I'm playing my keyboard. Oh, let's hear that rack synth, and because otherwise every time they played it, the keyboard would be happening. Now, if you start looking into that with your devices, I think you might find that this is possibly where you've got feedback loops happening. There could be something sending redundant messages because of the local settings somewhere in the chain. This is one thing, like I was saying about, if anybody's thinking about this, to just check out, the exact specs and what it does. For example, the only way you've got control over local with this is with a MIDI controller. So you would have to do it in the DAW. You would have to basically in live, I'd have to make a clip, which it's some obscure MIDI CC, but you send a value on that and it would turn local off. But then you've got to remember to turn it back on.
Right, and that will be in the manual probably.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. So, but I think that is what you need to, that is the area you need to investigate. Start looking at local and see if any of your devices are sending like redundant messages, and then it's causing a feedback loop. Okay. It can be a nightmare. I mean, I know back in the day we always used to have big fat MIDI interfaces with eight MIDI sockets on it as well. It could be worth, it could be worth investigating something else, because I know a lot of people do chains even now. They'll go and spend some money on some nice vintage synths, and then they're going MIDI in and through etc.
Yeah,
but that can cause problems. So it might be worth having a hunt around on eBay, because if you can find a USB, I know things like the Uniter 8, the last version of that, they did a USB version of that, and that has like 8 MIDI ports on it. So basically you plug that into your machine, and it would see 8 potential MIDI ins and outs, and they'd all be on individual cables. So you don't have to. You're going to reduce this risk of there being feedback.
Yeah. And you don't have to do channels that way as well.
Exactly.
Which can be a pain.
Yeah, because and again, yes. Well, for example, with this, if I want to change the MIDI channel on this, I have to use there's a kind of an app which I can fire up and use that to set the MIDI send and receive channels on this. So being able to get out of that is quite handy. So.
Yeah, for sure. It's getting very dorky, isn't it? This is good. So just to make it even more nerdy, Thomas Lear is asking, can you explain the MIDI clock type song versus pattern? This kind of comes up in Logic. I don't know if it's so much of a problem in Ableton.
Yeah, it's not really something that I've investigated in Ableton, because I just turned it on. I turned on the sync in the MIDI tab, and that's working. It's fine. I've got to be honest. I'm not even 100% sure if we can send different types of clock. To be honest, I'll be totally honest with you, Thomas. I've not even investigated that. I guess I'm just lucky that it just worked.
Yeah.
So I didn't have to go any further down that route. I'm really not sure. But I mean, generally speaking, the finer points of MIDI clock, if you're using older stuff, that's when you're going to have to start thinking about it. I do know, some devices can kind of generate MIDI clock of their own, but I think we're lucky because this has got the USB. I can just send this straight over. So I wish I could be more help to you there, and unfortunately, I'm a bit out of the loop.
That's cool. Morgan Huggins, follow up to the TR8 as well. The analog output is what I do, but then he can't split into different channels.
Oh, okay. So presumably, yeah. So that's the disadvantage of the TR8. So obviously a 909 or an 808 had individual outputs, but Roland aren't gonna. Yeah, that's a bit of a pain. That's a tough one. I mean, I guess. Yeah, I can't.
Don't know.
That's a tough one. That's a really tough one.
If you got any suggestions for Morgan, let us know, because that is probably a common problem. No,
that's a shame, because you could kind of cheat with ADAT out.
Yeah.
But then again, that would probably cause clock problems as well. So yeah, I mean, I guess if you could bear to, I mean, I guess it depends how you're mixing. If he's mixing analog, then it's a problem. If he's not, I guess you do have that option, the slightly tedious but available option of working, you know, writing your track, but then rendering the individual drum sounds as audio, like just soloing it and bouncing each one.
That's what I do with my Mackie mixer.
Yeah, and as you know from when I've been on here before talking about mixing, rendering stuff as audio is always, you know, I think we should all do it. You know, we should finish things. You know what I mean? We should say, right, that's done.
Commit to it.
Yeah, and then 20 years later, it will be there for you to, you know, include in the box set retrospective of your amazing career.
Yeah, and another thing which we didn't really touch on, which is also a factor in all this latency, is your actual sound card's latency. So, Jem Bifola is asking, he wants to know about the software delay which is added when I'm monitoring, how to evade it.
So the software delay is going to be directly affected by the buffer size, and also if you're using, I mean, my advice is if you're using external devices with Ableton Live, always use the external instrument, you know, because then that way you've got a bit of control to be able to try and rein it in and get it back in.
But there's also the little D button.
Yes.
So you can do it per channel. That's what I have to
Absolutely. Yeah. No, that absolutely. If I make those visible, you can do track delays there as well. You know, I've people sometimes use those quite creatively. I'm sure there was a Claude Von Stroke video for Point Blank where he was talking about using those. So he programs beats and he just goes in on one of them and like the shaker and just pushes it out a little bit. So, but that will help you as well. I mean, obviously, be careful. You don't want to get into a kind of and just get losing track of what's been delayed in which direction and stuff like that. You know? This is the thing with stuff like this. I would say just keep it simple. You know, and get more confidence. Okay. And then start to expand on that. So
cool. I think we've got time for one more question.
Cool.
Which is Brass Electro is asking, can you show how to write an automation with external MIDI CC?
Oh my goodness.
So you'd need to, first of all, you need to look up the CC in the manual. So you know what.
So whatever the most important
most
thing
of them are
is,
the same, aren't they? The first.
There's classic MIDI CCs that are shared by lots of devices. You know, I mean the whole thing of MIDI was the idea of a standard, wasn't it originally? So, but obviously as time's gone on, there's more and more wacky stuff that needs to be controlled. Now, obviously, I can't do it with this because we can't. The sort of stuff that we would want to be automating. There are CCs which will control elements of this, but I can't do like the cutoff and stuff like that. But basically, we would be looking at. Let me see if I can just pop a little. It's so long since I've done this in Ableton Live. I'm going
if you
quite
just go
bravely.
Open the envelope.
Oh, of course, and then there we go, and we can go MIDI control,
and then you've got them
all. And there we go. So this is all of our controllers here, and as you can see, there's standard ones. This is what Declan was talking about. So you can see we've got pitch bend, channel pressure first, and then we got these ones which are generally accepted as standard values. You know, modulation being the classic one. Breath control. That's always one that it's lasted so long. You know. That's for when people used to have like MIDI saxophones and stuff like that. Well, I think I've seen something relatively recently. You know, somebody's made a wacky controller.
Star Wars.
And then basically, what you want to do is you just want to get in there and choose whichever one it is you need to use. So if it says, I don't know, 56. Set that to 56 and then start drawing your automation in there. It's basically as simple as that.
And you could actually send that CC separately to the riff.
Absolutely.
So you could send it out so that the CC could loop 4 bars, but the riff could loop 64 bars or vice versa.
It would make sense to have maybe to be running 2 separate tracks. One for doing the notes, one for doing the MIDI CCs, like you said, so you can kind of get it going in different iterations. The one thing that I'm trying to remember what the controller is, but there is a bit of a restriction in Ableton Live because I've got a Syntechno TB, which is like this fantastic 90s analog 303 clone, this bright yellow rack unit. The only problem with it is if you want to do a slide, you have to use a MIDI CC, and I think it might be 0. I think it's MIDI CC 0, which Ableton Live can't do. So I can't use it in Ableton Live.
So it should be 0 to 127, but it's 1 to 128.
Yeah.
Come on, Ableton.
There's other software you can get software to kind of translate on MIDI on its way out, but I've got another one that I ended up using for my
cool.
acid escapades.
Anyway,
So,
we could talk about this all day, and more questions are coming in, but unfortunately, we are out of time.
I'll have a look at the video later, and I'll try and answer anything else.
Anthony will
jump
back.
Yeah, I'll jump on. So.
All right, cool. So hopefully you got plenty of inspiration for the weekend from that, and if you want to learn much more about Ableton Live, mixing, and external instruments, make sure you check out our courses at pointblanklondon.com. We'll be back next week for another FFL looking at what's new in Reactor 6, but until then, we will see you there.